Looking at the recent movement which is happening in Turkey, the president is Erdogan, yeah, whatever you like, and trying to use the force against the people who are opposing the idea of changing the nature of the political form of the Turkey from the secular democracy to a popular Islamism such as Muslim democracy. And as long as the EU believes the idea and concrete the idea of the secular democracy, and the EU have the right to cut the aid towards the Turkey to achieve the political goal which is political goal of the Turkey. That's why we on the side of affirmative is extremely proud to propose this particular motion. Three things I want to tell you as a Prime Minister. Firstly, examine the principal aid and why it's a legitimate strategy for EU to make the aid contingent towards the Turkey. And secondly, I finally examine the situation which is happening in Turkey and why Turkey doesn't deserve. And thirdly, I'll tell you how effective actually the aid is to rectify the problem happening in Turkey. That's the basic lines of argumentation coming from affirmative. Before that, I'll tell you the model in this debate. And EU within the entire EU entity will cut development, particularly development aid for the Turkey as an opposition claim for the Turkey, and which is happening in Turkey about the political changing the nature of the political form and from secular democracy like a Muslim democracy. And we use this policy as a transitional enforcement, so that if Turkey is ready and prepared to regain the secular democracy which used to exist, we are more than happy to abolish this policy and continue providing aid if Turkey is ready. That's the transitional enforcement is the gist of our policy. Moving on first issue about the principle of aid briefly. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a legitimate strategy for the government to put some aid or put some conditional financial aid precisely because the budget coming from the tax or the people on the ground, and as long as people believe in some condition or some belief as a justice, of course we can do that. That's the simple principle of the budget, and the government have to abide by the will of the citizen. That's the strategy of the aid we have. And particularly this logic is important in EU states precisely because one, EU citizens believe democracy, or particularly secular democracy, as the form of the justice, and moreover, and that's why the EU nation uphold sovereignty and create a regional community, and which is more likely to achieve those kind of secular democracy, which is not bounded by sovereignty. So particularly, we are talking about the case of the EU, and the EU strongly believes the idea of democracy, which is strong enough to uphold sovereignty within the regional community. And that's why we have the EU countries, and it's okay for the EU countries to use the secular democracy as a contingent, as a condition on the aid for the Turkey. And those kind of looking at other parts of the world, those kind of the conditioning is already done in various kind of spheres. And Japan cut ODA for China because China never agreed with the principle coming from the Japan. So it's okay for the Japan to cut the aid towards the China or the Moldova, and it's okay for the numerous legitimate strategy for the numerous levels of democracy to make the development aid contingent to ensure the achievement of the development aid. That's why it's okay for the country to set the usage, or whatever like so. So the making contingent is the legitimate strategy for the government to make some goals, particularly political goals towards some nations. That's the basic principle of the aid, and I further examine why Turkey doesn't deserve the aid coming from EU. Ladies and gentlemen, now the Turkey is getting against the idea of the secular democracy which EU challenging, and the Turkey is now going for the Islamic democracy or the popular majoritarian Islamism in the forcible ways, not the democratic ways. How? And in the Taksim Square, the camp of the opposition group was torn down by using the force or the water cannon or the tear gas, but outside army using force, not the democratic way such as dialogue or whatever like. And the president, Erdogan, broadly threatening the opposition party by using the logic of the hosting Olympics or whatever so on. So those kind of the forcible coercion, by the Turkish government is now happening, and we can no longer say it's a democratic process, particularly secular democratic process. Moreover, ladies and gentlemen, and even if those kind of the changes happening in a democratic way to the democratic end is okay, but the Turkey was trying to achieve the Muslim democracy, which is completely coercive to a particular group of people, and particularly people who believe in the idea of the secular ideas in Turkey. That's why, ladies and gentlemen, for these two reasons, because one, the changes happening not the democratic way, and two, the goal isn't so democratic. Looking at many places of the Arab country, those the religious politics is particularly oppressive towards certain group of the people. So for these two reasons, we believe Turkey doesn't deserve the aid coming from the country or the regional community who believe in the idea of the secular democracy as the form of the justice. And lastly, we examine how effective actually it is. Sorry. Ladies and gentlemen, we are trying to approach the metaphorical way to express the attitude in a political way. What I mean by that, ladies and gentlemen, in the issue of the political stimulus, of course that we can envisioning the opposition claims towards the Turkey by using the material ways. So that even if the United States nation to Iraq by just saying you suck, you proliferate nuclear weapon or whatever so on, by not doing anything, it's not effective in the first place because states fail to envisioning their own claim towards a particular country. That's why the EU country is more happy to use the material way to envisioning the opposition claim towards the Turkey, and we oppose your identity, we oppose what you're doing. That's why we cut the aid. That's the opposition claim from the EU to Turkey. So in the case of the political stimulus and the cutting aid will create strong political message towards the Turkey. That's the unique effect of the aid is. And secondly, more importantly, important for the economic sphere, and we can see the Turkey's incentive to stop oppression towards the particular group of person. Why? Two reasons. Firstly, the impact of aid is considerable even in Turkey. That's the simple logic. Even if Turkey enjoying the unprecedented economic growth, of course, as long as Turkey dependent on the EU aid, it means it means that those kind of amount of aid coming from the EU is still considerable amount within Turkish government. And moreover, even if those kind of amount of aid isn't so considerable, but we can create a change in Turkey. How? Because, ladies and gentlemen, we can threatening the good relationship of the Turkey as a trading partner, which is represented by the FTA between Turkey and EU countries. So the EU, if EU oppose the existence of Turkey or the Turkey is doing in an economical way, of course the Turkey fear the spill over those effects in the other economical ways such as trading system or whatever so on. So, ladies and gentlemen, this policy will create a strong political message towards Turkey, and this policy will create economic incentive for Turkey to reconsider their action, which is finally connected to the regulation of Turkey. That's why we propose.
Thank you for speech. Next, I'd like to call upon the leader of the today.
Mr. Speaker, I've never been so frustrated not having a POI nostril style because almost everything they said about Turkey and its relation with the EU was wrong. The fact that they give humongous amount of aid to the point where they require it is wrong. The fact that Turkey is turning into an Islamist democracy is wrong. The fact that the EU is trying to spread democracy throughout the world is wrong. Why else would they be funding aid in China and selling weapons to Saudi Arabia? So this kind of double standard makes absolutely no sense. We believe that this effect will be at the minimal paltry, and the only thing it will create is an antipathy by the Turkish people and all of Islam in the Middle East, which will completely destroy its relations with the EU. That's why we beg to oppose. First, I'm going to talk about the diplomatic staff of the EU and why this is completely inconsistent with what they have done throughout the ages and even now. Second, I want to talk about how this will impact the alliance with Turkey, especially in terms of their alliance as a NATO member state, and how this will be extremely damaging to all the EU and European members trying to do policy in the Middle East, particularly when it comes to Syria and its uprising. Third, my partners are going to talk about how this will portray EU as an anti-Islamic organization and how that will hamper their ability to project any kind of influence on the region. But first, some rebuttal. He said that aid to Turkey is substantial and therefore it's going to make a major difference. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, EU is currently in a recession. Obviously, they're going to cut aid, and that's fine. But the problem is, like, they don't have any kind of leverage against Turkey. Turkey is one of the largest economies in the Middle East. They're growing at 5%. It's not like they're going to, like, in a huge problem of not having enough aid or any kind of money to begin with. So we don't see any kind of tangible effect this will cause against the Turkish government. They are flush with cash, so they don't really need it. And they said another issues of economy, because they said, like, you know, they need to trade with the EU, and that kind of the relationship is important. Just as Turkey's relations with the EU is important, EU's relations with Turkey is extremely important because they also trade a lot of goods with Turkey. An oil pipeline that leads to the EU goes through Turkey. So we don't see this deal goes both ways. We don't think one side has huge leverage over the other. Now first, about the issue of EU diplomatic stance and policy. Because they seem to think that EU is some kind of champion of democracy where they sanction every country that has never carried out that kind of oppressive actions. But they have very good relations with China, despite the fact that it is clearly a one-party state. Saudi Arabia is one of the last absolute monarchies in the world, and yet Britain sells hundreds of billions of dollars of weapons to Saudi Arabia. Like, this kind of double standards make absolutely no sense. It is true that EU stands on a platform of democracy and they try to push democracy elsewhere, but they do not act and make member states to commit draconian actions against those countries because clearly they believe that economic inclusion is much more important and much more effective in creating kind of democratic process. That's why EU doesn't, like, you know, send troops to Greece when there is, like, a demonstration to make them pay for their cash or so forth. And the fact of the matter is, they don't have that much leverage to begin with. Like, most member states decide their diplomatic actions on their own. So we don't think that EU, in its infinite powers, have any right or power to force any member states to do anything. And anything that they will be doing will be totally hypocritical. Because when you look at Turkey, yes, it is true that they have overdone their crackdown on demonstrations. But they have done that in demonstrations in Greece. Are you going to cut all kind of financial aid which will collapse Greece because they sent water cannons and gas their own people in Greece demonstrations? That makes absolutely no sense. On the issue of it turning into an Islamic state, like, it is true that Islam is becoming more prominent in Turkey, but there is no EU constitutional law that says that all democracy they support has to be secularist. Like, Germany has a party called the Christian Democratic Union that has absolutely also proclaimed those kind of Christian values, and that kind of secularism is at the best a secondary position when it's compared to absolute democracy, whether the country is a democracy or not. So we believe that Turkey still, Erdogan, despite those demonstrations, still have majorities, or they have full members in parliament, and the elections are considered free and fair. So we don't see, if you are against Turkey, then you are against many, many countries in the EU who actually have elections that are dodgy as well. So we don't think Turkey is a unique target that could be sanctioned or in any way be harmed in this proposal. That brings me to the issue of what happens when you lose Turkey, because they seem to think that, you know, economic aid is the only thing that they have. This is the biggest problem, right? They're part of NATO, which means that they send military aid as well as they have military assistance to the Turkey. What happens if you cut those off, which they will have to, because, you know, they can't just cut off economic aid saying, so we don't pay you, but we'll give you weapons to shoot your own people. Like, that makes no sense. So they'll have to obviously cut NATO aid as well, and then we believe that is extremely problematic because Turkey is one of the valuable allies within the region that allows NATO to protect its power and influence to the Middle East. If they lose any ability to use, and obviously Turkey is going to be extremely angry at the double standards and the treatment they get of this nature. Because they've always been cooperative with the EU throughout like, you know, when they tried to gain EU membership, for example. But the only reason they were rejected is because France and Germany was racist and they didn't want Turkish immigrants into their own country. Like, that level of double standard is already prevalent, and we believe that any cut into NATO or any kind of those kind of aid will be perceived as an extreme racist act against Turkish people, and they will respond much harsher than the EU can ever do against Turkey. So what will happen in terms of NATO? They cannot cooperate on military issues. Any kind of issue that happens, for example, in Iraq, which requires many kinds of assistance from Turkey to stabilize the region, they will lose that ability to cooperate with them. And also, the biggest problem is Syria, ladies and gentlemen, because Turkey is one of the very few actors that supports full-heartedly and gives safe havens to rebels within Syria, and also will be obviously a staging ground for any EU support they will give to Syrian rebels. If you cut off aid to Turkey, and Turkey goes against the EU, then any support the EU tries to do to Syria will be extremely difficult, because Turkey will not let it happen. They'll think that EU projecting any power against Syria will be a neo-colonial threat against Syria, and also their own politicians will play that kind of rhetoric to gain their own support, and they'll find it very easy to portray EU as an anti-Islamic, xenophobic, racist state members that will try to hamper the Turkish regime. We believe overall, this entire policy is extremely hypocritical, has no standards, not a single iota of consistency with the policy of the EU or any of its member states. That's why we beg to oppose this.
Mr. Speaker, I return all the niceties that have been said by previous speaker to himself by analyzing in my refutation how his analysis actually borders with ridiculous and sometimes outrageous. Before I go into refutation, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to outline our stance once again. In 1964, Turkey has been granted an associated membership in the EEC, which was the precursor to the EU. It was thought that Turkey will be joining EEC and EU in the future, so Turkey naturally was given a kind of a scholarship so that it could drive its economy, its social conditions, and its political system closer to the ideal that we see in the European Union, Mr. Speaker. Now, what we face in Turkey right now is a movement in the opposite direction. While they achieve significant economic growth, the political situation is deteriorating and goes against the values that are held by the European Union. What happens, Mr. Speaker, if you do not fulfill your obligations? What happens with your scholarship? It gets revoked, and that's what we are defending here, Mr. Speaker. We've seen popular Islamic laws being propagated in Turkey that say that Islam should be the state religion. You see clear difference with Germany, Mr. Speaker? You can practice Islam in Germany, but nobody imposes Christianity on you. Nobody imposes Buddhism on you. Or atheism, for that matter, Mr. Speaker. We separate religion and church, and secularism is one of the most highly valued values in the European Union. Turkey goes against that, Mr. Speaker. Turkey forces aggression against ethnic minorities such as Armenians. In 2006, the editor of an anti-governmental newspaper, Hrant Dink, was assassinated in the midst of Istanbul, Mr. Speaker. The assassinators, the perpetrators, have not been found yet, Mr. Speaker. This is ridiculous. So, the government perpetuates that hatred towards minority. The government suppresses political dissent. You can remember the Ergenekon issue, where lots of opposition leaders, media leaders, and military figures have been jailed at the suspicion of trying to overturn the rule of the ruling AK party, Mr. Speaker. Those allegations have not been proven, but people are in prison. That's what we face in Turkey, and that's why we have all the justification to revoke the scholarship that Turkey has been given if it does not reverse, if it doesn't change its ways. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to analyze their stance within this debate. First of all, their claim number one, that EU's aid, that is so small now, as they claim, will not change the weather in Turkey. But then, at the same time, Mr. Speaker, they claim that it will cause such a huge backlash, that the geopolitical situation will change, that the whole Islamic world will hate the European Union and the West, and I don't know, the third world war will start, something. Choose which one do you follow, please. Be consistent, Mr. Speaker. Secondly, as Yonaga pointed out, EU's leverage is much bigger than just the scholarship it gives to Turkey, Mr. Speaker. And it is fun to notice that for Turkey, EU is the major trading partner. But for EU, Turkey is not the major trading partner. Which means that EU has a bigger leverage when it comes to economic relationships with Turkey. Which means that EU can use significantly huge power to persuade Turkey to change its ways without suffering from, reciprocal restrictions from Turkey. Point number two, Mr. Speaker. They claim that EU's aid policy is inconsistent. Nothing could be farther from truth. The only example they provided with is, UK trading arms with Saudi Arabia. Mr. Speaker, hello. It's trade, it's not aid policy. When you trade goods, you do that in return for money. EU does not support Saudi Arabia with economic aid, probably because Saudi Arabia is has much more money than lots of EU countries, Mr. Speaker, and doesn't face an economic recession. They're talking bullshit to you, don't buy that. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, another example, UK has stopped its aid to Uganda after Uganda proposed to punish homosexualism by death, which shows that EU is very consistent. We will still trade with you, we will maintain political and economic relationship, but, Mr. Speaker, aid is different. We play aid, we take money from our taxpayers to promote certain causes. We do not do that for free, Mr. Speaker. It has to follow some sort of final goal. Third point, Mr. Speaker, the military analysis. First of all, in his military analysis, the previous speaker messed up NATO and the European Union, which is a very brilliant thing to do. Because one of the biggest aid suppliers through the NATO mechanism to Turkey is the United States of America, which is not part of the EU, Mr. Speaker. That's point number one. Secondly, that aid goes to reinforcing Turkey's military, not promoting political diversification, pluralism, and respect for minorities, Mr. Speaker. Their aims are completely different. Thirdly, Mr. Speaker, their assertion that Turkey will suddenly stop supporting rebels in Syria and will change sides to Assad is ridiculous. Turkey borders on Syria, unlike European Union, which means Turkey is interested in stability and soon win of revolution in Syria and soon stop of carnage and bloodshed in that country. So Turkey will always be interested, and even more interested than the EU, in intervening into Syria in an efficient way. Now, there are fourth points about backlash, which leads me to my extension, Mr. Speaker. How Turkey will not go well, this is what I'm going to prove to you in my speech. First of all, as we have pointed out many times, Turkey is well integrated into the world community and specifically within Europe. Turkey is part of NATO, Turkey is the associate member of the EU, and EU is the biggest trading partner for Turkey, Mr. Speaker. If they lose their biggest trading partner, their major exports partner, they will lose a significant bulk of economic growth, which will not find support within their citizenship, right? Secondly, Mr. Speaker, look at Iran. What sanctions have done with Iran? The West has applied sanctions for many years. Did it cause backlash? No. Why? Because Iranians elected a moderate leader, Rouhani, during the presidential elections a few weeks ago. So it didn't cause a backlash, it actually moderated Iran's stance. Iranians recognize that if they do not comply with what international society is demanding, they're gonna suffer. The message has been said. Sanctions make wonders, Mr. Speaker. Now take a look at North Korea, where we cannot impose any sanctions. What happens? We only say words. What happens? North Korea tests missiles, North Korea tests nuclear weapons, North Korea behaves in a very bad way and never changes its ways, Mr. Speaker. So, if we continue with our aid, no strings attached, what kind of message do we send to Turkey? We say, we do not care what you do with your own people. No matter what, we will support your regime, even if it turns into an ugly Islamist dictatorship. No matter what, we will take money from our taxpayers who are in dire straits right now and send it to you. What kind of message EU has to send, Mr. Speaker? I think everybody in this room now agrees that EU has to say, we are ready to act swiftly and exercise pressure on you as long as you do not change your ways. For the sake of better democratic future for Turkey and more consistency in EU's aid policy, we beg you to propose. Thank you.
Next, I have the call of the Deputy Leader of Opposition of the Delegates on coming speech with the Yeah.
Mr. Speaker, this policy not only affects the principal stance of the Turkey as a political entity, but also affects the people on the ground, but also affects people's mindset and foment anger within the people, Mr. Speaker. And therefore, that is why we are now saying that we are going to lose Turkey in the very first place, and we are going to lose the bridge between the West and the Eastern countries, and we are going to lose the very important Islamic allies, and therefore we are going to lose the peace within those kind of sphere, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that is significant loss, and that is what we are not supporting here today. I'm going to picture how the mindset of a citizen is going to be changed and how it affects the politicians in the Turkey and around the countries, and how it breaks the very peaceful sphere between those kind of regions, including the Kurdish regions and including Iran, Iraq, or maybe Syria. But before that, I'm going to look at what the previous speaker has said. So the previous speaker has told to you that it is really important for the Turkey to embrace the full principle of the democracy, but they didn't really explain why at all only this plan can ensure the full democracy in Turkey in the very first place. They didn't explain any mechanism, how at all they can ensure and how at all they can fabricate some kind of principle of democracy under their paradigm, Mr. Speaker. That is severely damaging to their entire case. But secondly, Mr. Speaker, they told you that Turkey is now currently negating the accountability on EU and accountability on the democracy. But Mr. Speaker, my partner has already told you, and everybody in this room knows that Turkey has a fair election, Turkey has a fair check and balance system, and Turkey has now transitioning into more democratic country, Mr. Speaker. Turkey is now moving forward, and Turkey is changing, Mr. Speaker. That is enough, and that is why now people is demonstrating against those kind of oppressive regimes right now, Mr. Speaker. That is what we are seeing here today, and that is why Turkey is now changing and transitioning into more democratic country, and that is why we say status quo is enough. Secondly, they talked about the backlash, and backlash isn't occur under this plan, so there is no harm. But they totally misunderstood my partner's point. My partner's point was about the double standard which EU imposes against Turkey, Mr. Speaker. Because, under their paradigm, the EU is going to impose some kind of political symbolism on the EU that you should embrace more democratic principle. However, those kind of EU state and member state is going to demand more military friendlyship and more military intervention towards Syria, or maybe towards countries like Gaddafi was there or something like that, Mr. Speaker, right? So those kind of double standard foment the anger within the people, and that is when we are going to see the backlash within the people on the ground, Mr. Speaker. And he also talked about NATO is founded funded by mainly USA. But he didn't negate that all the member states of the EU is now paying the money towards the NATO and aiding for those kind of Turkey, Mr. Speaker, which implies that, Mr. Speaker, after taking this proposal, those kind of member state is going to cut out those kind of military aids to Turkey, and Turkey is going to face a severe reduction in the military aid, Mr. Speaker. So that kind of thing is going to also happen, Mr. Speaker. USA doesn't matter, but what does matter is the member states of the EU, Mr. Speaker. And more than that, Mr. Speaker, we don't understand why at all stop aiding uniquely creates some kind of democratic movement within the Turkey, Mr. Speaker. Because we say that cutting aid is not the same as a sanction, Mr. Speaker. Right? So we don't think why at all those kind of Turkey is suddenly is going to lose some kind of friendship between the trading sphere, Mr. Speaker. Because Turkey can enjoy as much trade as status quo, Mr. Speaker. There's no effect and no workability on the side of the house. We don't think why at all this plan is uniquely effective on the Turkey. And secondly, we say Turkey is now transitioning into a more democratic country, so why not it is not enough, Mr. Speaker? That is a question. So, firstly, Mr. Speaker, onto my substantive material, I'm going to talk to you why at all their policy prevent EU from achieving its own goal to spread the democratic movement throughout the world, Mr. Speaker. But Mr. Speaker, it is simple. The mindset of the people in Turkey or the people in Islamic allies is going to be changed, and is going to be changed into more anti-EU and more anti-democratic stance, Mr. Speaker. And I'm going to picture and explain why those kind of happens. So, Mr. Speaker, we have to look at what is cutting aid, Mr. Speaker. We are talking about all kinds of aid. Those kinds of aid includes, of course, economic aid and military aid, but also includes education and societal aid, Mr. Speaker. That kind of things has more importance towards the people on the ground, Mr. Speaker. EU says that EU won't make your country grow, Mr. Speaker, right? And you are not friend of the EU anymore, and you should never be included within the EU sphere and within the democratic sphere. And that is totally problematic. Why is that? Well, firstly, the citizens is going to embrace more anti-EU stance and more anti-democratic stance, Mr. Speaker. Because citizens in the Turkey will think that EU rejects you, and EU is never going to be inclusive towards the Islamic countries, Mr. Speaker. As my partner already told you, Turkish people gave up many things, right, Mr. Speaker? Did many things to the EU in the past, Mr. Speaker. They revised the criminal law, they abolished the death penalty, and they divorced from their own identity and own Islamic identity to get closer to the EU. But suddenly, EU says you're never going to be joining in the EU and you're going to be rejected, Mr. Speaker. All of a sudden, without any necessary step and without any signs, those kind of things is going to be conducted, and without giving any time to anticipate those kind of harsher punishment is going to occur, Mr. Speaker. And that is how people is going to be angry, and that is how people can never understand the stance of the EU, and that is how they're going to accumulate anger towards the double standard of the EU, Mr. Speaker. And it also affects the mindset of the politicians in Turkey, Mr. Speaker. Well, because politicians want to have a vote and want to have a support from the citizens, Mr. Speaker. And when the citizens are now embracing the anti-EU stances, politicians necessarily have to take anti-EU stance to get a vote and get a support, Mr. Speaker. And that is why politicians is going to foment the anger within the citizens, and is going to make that anger more bigger, Mr. Speaker. And that is how you're going to embrace more extreme policy and more anti-EU policy within Turkey. And that is how we are going to lose the very important Islamic allies, Mr. Speaker, right? Because citizens in Turkey now feels that they're rejected, and a citizen in an Islamic country who share the same value as the Turkey is going to also think that EU will never be inclusive towards the Islamic people and towards other people, Mr. Speaker, right? So that is. And also, Mr. Speaker, the politicians in Turkey is going to embrace a more extreme policy to gain ally between the Middle Eastern countries, and that is why Turkey and other Islamic countries is going to cement more stronger and to be to become isolated within democratic spheres, Mr. Speaker, right? So that's why those kind of country is never going to be included in the EU sphere and included in the democratic sphere, and that's how you are never going to achieve the goal of the EU, Mr. Speaker. Therefore, also broke the principle of the EU, and therefore also make the humanitarian crisis more likely to happen, and that's why we are not support this motion. We oppose.
On the government rate to summarize the European aid. Yeah.
There are lots of things that are jumbled up in today's debate, so I'm going to separate the issues for you and clarify from two perspectives why the proposition takes this debate. Firstly, let's look at the idea of whether the EU has discretion over stopping aid or not. Secondly, let's look at the practical ramifications of depriving Turkey of their aid. And all the rebuttals will be integrated into the second point for the FTE proposition. Let's look at the idea of whether the EU has discretion over Turkey in terms of aid. What we told you from the previous speakers, ladies and gentlemen, is the idea that EU itself has interest and gives conditionality on the basis of certain criteria, like democracy or liberalism or secularism. And we use aid to promote those kind of values in all institutions. When the UK threatens to withdraw developmental aid from Uganda, when Uganda decided to execute homosexuals simply for being homosexuals, that shows you that there is a liberalist agenda that the EU and its member states operate on, so the EU fundamentally has discretion under these kind of things. Second, we give you the specific example of the objective of the aid to Turkey. Ladies and gentlemen, we told you from second speaker about how this was grooming Turkey for membership, ladies and gentlemen. It means that Turkey was given aid in return for democracy, in return for liberalism, in return for secularism, Mr. Speaker. Well, let's look at the idea of it being inconsistent, which is basically what happened. Double standards. Yeah, big deal, right? So let's look at the idea of the double standard. One, we think that it's not a double standard because it is compliant with the EU's general principle of promoting democracy and liberalism. Two, it is compliant with the idea of the objective in which the aid was given in the first place. We gave that aid to Turkey specifically so we could groom it for EU membership, specifically so we could give them a ground to which they can develop a democracy, develop a secularist government. The fact that they are now moving in the opposite direction and going towards a majoritarian Islamic democracy is enough to tell you that they no longer fulfill the conditions of that specific aid and can be withdrawn. Now let's look at the idea coming from Toshi. This is really interesting. They told you that this is not a substantial aid, and therefore the EU is in recession. Fine, if the EU is in recession, that's another reason to cut off aid, right? You should rather prioritize the EU over Turkey. That's another reason to cut off aid and give it to us, right? It doesn't really work that way. Two, let's look at the idea of it being inconsistent. There are free elections in Turkey. Mr. Speaker, free elections does not mean democracy. Free election, by its own, means moral majoritarianism, which is the majority being able to do whatever they want. And let's look at how majoritarianism is being exercised in Turkey. We gave you the idea that the reason why the protests in Turkey began in the first place was due to a prohibition law that banned alcohol. The banning of alcohol is legitimized on Islamic law, is legitimized on Islamic grounds, which are not secular, which are not liberal, but which are majoritarian. And that's why there is a heap load of controversy regarding that. Mr. Speaker, we think that there is a difference between majoritarianism and democracy. We think that it's not enough to say free elections has happened, because look at all the oppression towards the Kurdish people who still do not have a proper autonomy. Look at all those people who have been
jailed by the Turkish government precisely under the guise of majoritarian security, Mr. Speaker. We think that that's not free. We don't think that that's liberal. We don't think that that's secular. We think that we are being consistent when we withdraw aid from Turkey. So we think that the EU is actually executing a legitimate discretion that they have in consistency with several parts of their policy. Let's look at the idea of the practical ramifications of taking this proposal. And they look at aid. And this is where it gets really interesting, right? Because the DLO told you there's not much leverage, except for education, except for military, and except for antagonizing the entire Turkish nation by withdrawing aid. Which is it? You can't have it both ways, Mr. Speaker. But let's look at whether the antagonism actually works, right? The reason you assume that removing aid from Turkey automatically means that the citizens turn against the EU. No, Mr. Speaker. Why is that? Because the majority of the citizens are already out there protesting for liberal democracy, protesting inside Taksim Square for a liberalist paradigm. Those people are probably going to welcome EU trade cutting of aid because it is actually consistent with their own beliefs that Turkey should be a liberal democracy. We think that the citizens are not going to be antagonized. The citizens are going to welcome external support in the form of EU removing benefits that are given on democratic grounds. It actually legitimizes the opposition and it actually vindicates them. We don't think that it leads to antagonism. We think that it rather leads to bigger support of the EU because the EU is now being consistent with their ideals and also because the EU is now being congruent with the ideals that the Turkish public themselves support. They don't want prohibition. They don't want Taksim Square destroyed. And the violent suppression of that popular movement by the Erdogan government is enough, firstly, to legitimize getting rid of sanctions. Secondly, it's not going to antagonize the Turkish public precisely because the Turkish public want exactly what the EU wants. And we think that that tool is enough. Let's look at the idea of leverage. Right? They told you that the EU has no leverage because the aid is so small, which is actually contradictory to the idea that the aid is going to antagonize every single person inside Turkey. Right? Well, we think that it's not going, and there is a certain degree of leverage. Why is that? Because we're giving free money at them. Anything that is free, once taken away, is going to prevent some kind of leverage, number one. Number two, we think that the EU is probably going to be sending a message that these more sanctions, which they are proposing, is going to follow. It's not like you can move directly to an invasion. You have to take several procedural steps. We think that the cutting of aid towards Turkey is a vital message that is sent to Turkey to say that if you do not comply with our demands, more is going to follow. And we think that that threat and that expectation of that threat perceived by Turkish politicians is also enough, right? What have we told you on our side of the house? We told you that the EU has discretion to work inconsistent with their ideals of democracy and secularism and liberalism. We told you that this does not cause backlash precisely because the majority of the Turkish public supports such measures. That's why they're already out in the streets protesting against them. That's why the images of Istanbul, which was censored by the Turkish national media, finds itself on Facebook and Twitter and is proliferated into not just into Turkey, but into the international world. We think that the Turkish themselves are crying out for democracy. We don't think, therefore, that these things are going to antagonize the Turkish public. Lastly, they talk about NATO. This is a really good one, right? We want stability in Syria. We want stability in Syria as well. We think that Turkey, through its military aid in NATO, not just the socio-economic aid in the EU, is enough. And if the EU and NATO are worried about Turkey being a vital harboring front, find Israel, Mr. Speaker. We think that there are myriads of alternatives. That doesn't make Syria unique. And for those reasons, we're still proud to propose.
Thank you for speech. Next, I have the quorum from the opposition committee to summarize the 8 points.
Yeah.
We want to question what democracy are they supporting on the outside of the house, right? We are supporting pluralistic values, right? There may be Islamic certain values. There may be like many ways that understands the society, right? But they are imposing just because it is Turkey and because these people are somehow inclining towards more Islamic. Like they want to ban anything, and they told us, the whip speaker told us, this is not go just cutting off pace. They said they will go sanctions, they will go like more extreme in order to make these countries democratic. How, Mr. Speaker, how their side of the house achieve democracy, Mr. Speaker? There's no mechanism against what Turkey is becoming more democratic, but other, for instance, Middle East countries, including Syria and other countries, become democratic by cutting off these things. Well, rather what we told you is that this is unjust justification to cut off aid, but secondly, we tell you that this will bad for Turkey to be more democratic for that instance. That's going to be my crush, and we're gonna go into that right now. So they told us EU's principle is liberal and secular democracies, and we need to support that. That's the reason why, right? The first reason why. So, firstly, we want to question what do you mean by secular democracies, right? There are certain values that are incorporated in, for instance, Germany, the Christian values, and other countries that are not just secular, but the religious values or ethnic values that are reflected within this political arena, right? It is about degree of secularism, Mr. Speaker. It is not the blanket monolithic idea that Islamic countries or other Christian ideology conveys within these countries, Mr. Speaker, right? But more importantly, what we tell you is that why only Turkey, right? We have questions from the leader of opposition. Like there's many other countries that are like under their criteria not democratic, right? We told you, for example, of Greece, like where they crack down severely on the Protestants when they have this sort of economic recession, right? These apply to other dodgy democracies, but they do not anything to other EU-friendly countries, right? But it's just racist. Just because these are the Muslim communities, they want to cut off for certain reasons. We think that is not wrong. We think that is wrong, right? But secondly, they told us, okay, Turkey is acting undemocratic within this country. For instance, they told us, Erdogan is cracking down on these sort of things. The first reason the whip speaker gave you is that, they are denying the liberal conception of these sort of protests. Mr. Speaker, the reason why the government of Turkey cracked down on these protests is not because these were meant to protect. The reason why because the Turkish citizens was angry, it's not because they are denied of that protest, but because the police and the government cracked down on these citizens, Mr. Speaker. That is not the reason that these sort of things were not the legitimate claim, Mr. Speaker, right? But secondly, they told us these sort of undemocratic in nature. We condemn that is wrong, right? Because firstly, we already told you, Turkey is democratic to begin with, right? It has a constitution, it has a agreed upon or majority rule by the Erdogan, right? But to note, Mr. Speaker, even if these people didn't like the Turkish government, they can actually reject by referendum on certain things, right? But the problem is, the Erdogan himself was actually re-elected, supported by the majority rule within that country, Mr. Speaker, right? Just because these people are going just with extreme Islamic, these countries, Turkey has abolished the penalty, revised the criminal law, revised the democratic process within that country, and we don't think why that is undemocratic enough for these people to deny the access for these sort of access to these sort of aids. But Mr. Speaker, but secondly, they Marx specifically told us there are sort of political dissent happening. For instance, assassination, what sort of stuff was that kind of stuff. Firstly, they themselves considered that is not verifiable, right? That is not true that the government actually did it to begin with. But secondly, Mr. Speaker, they told us the example of Uganda, Britain, they rejecting Uganda or something like that. We think that is false, right? Because Mr. Speaker, like Turkey, that country itself, is not executing just because you are homosexual, Mrs. Speaker. We are not going to that extent. We are accepting. Turkey is accepting homosexual, existing homosexual. It is not that these people's rights are not expanded to the degree of Western country yet, Mr. Speaker. These people, we think Turkey is ready to actually expand the definition of democracy to the extent right? To when these people are accepted by the EU countries, right? Then they said, well, then the Marx said, well, like when the Turkey was actually granted a ticket to the EEC, these people rejected. But the problem is, Mr. Speaker, when the Turkey was actually at that time, the reason why these people were democratic was because these people had a membership to EEC, Mr. Speaker. Once they rejected the EEC membership to Turkey, they actually once become radicalized, right? That is this sort of expungement of this membership will actually harm these sort of things. We give you an example, for instance, like Turkey actually stopping the relationship with Israel, when the Israel government actually stopped Turkey's ship to Israel, right? And therefore, these sort of symbolic means actually huge for Turkey to actually deny sort of like the democracy that they wanted to protect on their side of the house. So let's talk about the second issue, how this actually influenced Turkey. Mr. Speaker, their analysis was this: oh, just because we stopped setting eggs, like this will send huge message to this sort of Turkey. Like we question what sort of message are you sending to these people? Like once Turkey was rejected from the norm that they cannot be the EU membership, they were rejected the right to be part of that EU nation to begin with, right? And therefore they still have the antipathy towards this country, right? But moreover, once they cut off these eggs, these people, these EU people will deny the existence of Turkish way of having democracy, Mr. Speaker. That's how this is perceived by this sort of rejection of the right. Because this is the punishment rather than those sort of support what we are talking about, right? So what will happen? We told you what will happen is that when the NATO is Turkey is not part of the NATO, and when Turkey has a strong relationship with other countries, surrounding countries, including Syria, we think that support that the EU has as a buffer in this Middle East will be deprived. Why is that, Mr. Speaker? We told you popular majority is influencing the democracies because they never deny the Turkish democracy itself, right? And therefore citizens have significant influence towards the Turkey government. And therefore, when they wanted to actually support Syria and other Middle Eastern democracies, they will actually go against the EU's principle because democracies is what EU wants, and that is what Turkey wants to reject under their side of the model. And we think, Mr. Speaker, well, just because these people are cutting edge, we don't think we think cutting edge will significantly have this symbolic message towards Turkey. So, and they told us and also they told us because Turkey is significantly benefiting from EU, they will get the effect. But firstly, what we told you is EU actually needs Turkey to begin with, right? Not just the other way around. Because this is the biggest starter, and just because EU is in the recession that they are suffering from. But more important, it is not about economical damage. It is about the symbolic damage that Turkey was rejected from the Western world, that they cannot pursue their own way of having democracies. Because it damages Turkey, democracy in the East and Middle East, we are very happy to oppose.
Thank you for the speech. Next, I'd like to call on opportunity granted.
The theme of the government side's position is basically this. They have absolutely zero nuance whatsoever when it comes to diplomacy or argumentation in general. Because it's either you are a perfect liberal, utopian democracy or a dictatorship. You are either supporting by aid or you are completely rejecting. They have absolutely no notion that there are progress and sometimes backlash that are created because of symbolic reasons. They have no concept of how, yes, actual aid is small, but that symbolic effect is huge. These kind of nuances were way beyond those three, and that was unfortunate. Two things I'm going to talk about. First, about whether this policy is consistent with EU or whether it's a double standard. Second, whether the backlash itself is more damaging or they will more likely to reform their policy to a more secular democracy. So first, about the double standard. Because they themselves gave you ample amount of examples to show you how shaky their ground is. They said, well, there are possibilities of an assassination attempt against a journalist. There is crackdown occurring. When we said, well, there are crackdowns against austerity protests in Greece. No answer to that. They said, you know, there are populist democracy, populist Islam. It's like, yeah, but like the majority has elected these people over and over again. So it's like, what more are you asking for? And then they said, well, it's not secular. It's they're banning alcohol and they're not allowing these people to fully express their freedoms. Yes, that might be true, but like that wasn't a problem before they were given ECC membership, right? And then they were also about to get EU membership, only to get rejected because there were going to be too many immigrants coming into Turkey. So like they can't say that suddenly secularism is a big deal when they haven't said that before the elections, before they have supported people. They said, well, trading with Saudi Arabia is different because they're paying for us. Yes, so like if Turkey pays for all the weapons, it's okay to fund their dictatorial regime, but it's not okay if you give those aid. It's like, it makes no sense. And then we told you that Turkey has cracked down too much on its protesters. But protest happens all the time. Excessive crackdowns happens all the time. You have to prove why at this point, at this juncture, is the problematic. That brings me to the issue of backlash or reform. Because they said, well, you know, they will suddenly reform because no answer. There's nothing that came out from their arguments that said reform will happen because of a cut in aid. And we said, well, aid is too small to make an effect. They accused us of saying, well, then it will make no effect on backlash as well. So if you're accusing us that aid is small and therefore it will be no backlash, then there will be no effect on the political system as well. But we told you a much more nuanced approach. We told you that aid itself is small, but the symbolic nature will be huge. Because not only are they not rejected now from the EU completely, they're also rejected of any support whatsoever from the EU. And then they said, well, you know, we'll still keep trading with them. Like, NATO is not part of the EU, so it's fine. It's like UK, France, Germany, they're in both the EU and NATO, right? They can't say, oh, we'll give you aid as an EU member, but we won't give you aid as a NATO member. It makes no sense. They have to cut all aid to the Turkey, and that's going to be hugely problematic as a symbol, right? You're not a military ally, you're not an economic ally, because you simply step over the bounds. And then they kept on saying, well, you know, if the whip said, well, if that doesn't work, if this position doesn't work, we can keep going and says we can keep doing more economic sanctions. We can stop EU ban on Turkish imports. Like, though already that position in itself is simple, that EU is discriminatory because they don't punish Saudi Arabia, but they punish Turkey. They punish Turkey, but they don't punish China for their oppression of the Tibetan people. We believe that thus double standards only hurts the ability of the EU to influence policy within the country. That's why we oppose.
Let me go up on the government speech before.
Mr. Speaker, we on the government bench are under a strong impression that the opposition has finally found a textbook on Turkey by their whip speaker, but they still got all the facts wrong. I'd like to analyze all the new points introduced by the whip speaker, thank you, and then analyze this whole round for you and show you why we took it. First of all, Mr. Speaker, they accuse us that, you know, we discriminate against Turkey just because it's Turkey, just because it's Islam. Mr. Speaker, certain Max Krylov receives scholarship from the government of Japan for the sake of his own education. If Max Krylov does not follow the goal of that scholarship, that is, does not apply at studying, but enjoys nightlife in Tokyo, Should the government of Japan stop that scholarship? Of course, yes. Does the government of Japan has a discretion towards the name school? Of course, yes. Does it have discretion towards Tomoe Nagako? Does it receive the scholarship? Of course, no, Mr. Speaker. It's only natural. Same logic, by the way, applies to Greece, the example that they like so much. Mr. Speaker, EU dictates its will to Greece. It says implement austerity measures or will cut aid to you. This same logic should apply to Turkey. We provide you with money. That's why we say for what we provide you with money. Second point, Erdogan won the election, that's why he can do whatever he wants, Mr. Speaker. It's very easy to win an election when you can suppress all the dissenting votes, when you can, kill people on Taksim Square, kill independent journalists, or do not, follow the killings of independent journalists, and shut down independent TV channels, Mr. Speaker. Yes, that's very easy. And finally, Mr. Speaker, they say that the symbolic impact is so huge. There is critical difference between the Israel case and the case that we're proposing now. In Israel's case, it was an unwarranted and unexplained aggression against Turkish citizens. What we're talking about now, Mr. Speaker, is cutting an aid with a condition. We actually will then resume aid if Turkey follows a certain path. A path that is good for a huge portion of its population, Mr. Speaker. It will correspond to their will to be a democratic, developed, liberal country, Mr. Speaker. We're doing this for the sake of people of Turkey, while there will be their backlash. Which leads me to our major clash point today. Will Turkey go wild? Their whole case is based on one single assumption. That, Turks will go very radical towards the EU. We gave you an example of Iran, where severe sanctions brought to power not a radical, but a very moderate politician who talks about resuming talks with the West now, Mr. Speaker. Where will Turkey go in this paradigm, Mr. Speaker? Why will people suddenly turn anti-Western? Why won't they in turn realize that it's within their own interest to pressure their government to be more democratic, to be more secular? Otherwise they will be left without aid, without trade, without economic cooperation with the EU, Mr. Speaker. They never explain to us why all of a sudden they will become so anti-Western. Mr. Speaker, so in terms of Turkey going wild, our analysis is more detailed and it shows to you that odds are Turkey will grow more moderate because it's so well integrated with the West, with the EU. Their characterization of Turkey also does not stand any examination, Mr. Speaker. They say that since democracy is the rule of majority, everything that majority chooses is okay. Okay, what if majority chooses to eat Jews, eat children, eat homosexuals, Mr. Speaker? Democracy is not about the rule of majority. Democracy is actually about minority, how good minority is protected from the majority. That's what we've been pushing here, Mr. Speaker. We see that Turkey is making significant regress in that respect. And that is why we should apply pressure on Turkey to that. We've shown you that the EU has significant leverage on Turkey in political, economic, and security ways. And that's why we hope that those measures will succeed. But last but not the least, Mr. Speaker, even if the impact of our measures is small, even if it's close to zero, or even if they're right and it will be negative and Turkey will be alienated from the West, Mr. Speaker, we are given that money for a certain goal. If Turkey does not pursue that goal, we are completely justified to stop it. Thank you very much.